Hello friends, this is Growl. In part 2 of my Mythic Plus Resto guide, I'm going to be talking about basic rotational skills, as well as the defensive options and utility in the Resto Druid toolkit. This video will be a bit more freeform and gameplay oriented than the last, and after watching this video, you should have a good idea of what's expected of you during Mythic Plus runs, as well as a head start to efficient and precise play. So let's get started. The most important thing to talk about is of course your healing. One of the biggest strengths of Resto Druid is their flexibility of their healing. You'll be able to do large amounts of single target or group healing without having to spend much mana or rely on powerful cooldowns. The goal of your healing rotation should be continuously using different HOTS on targets as they need more and more healing, so that they're getting an ever increasing benefit from your mastery. The biggest challenge is how do we find that balance between having some HOTS active without spending the entire dungeon overhealing? I like to think of Resto Druid healing as a three-part system. Part 1 is your defense. These are the spells you should be maintaining nearly 100% of the time. This is to provide a small amount of healing to your party, and also to start a foundation of HOTS so that if you need to heal, you're not starting from nothing. I put Efflow, Life Bloom, and Cenarian Ward in this category. Efflow is one spell every 30 seconds that provides a heal over time to everyone in the party, and is an easy way to have a hot out on anybody who needs healing. Life Bloom and Cenarian Ward will be your two most powerful single target hots, generally to be placed on the tank. Remember that with Life Bloom, if there's one main target that needs healing, you should be keeping Life Bloom on them. And if there are two or more targets that need healing, you should generally be keeping Life Bloom on yourself. It's important to note that all three of these spells are instant cast, and they can and should be used if you're setting up a pull or about to engage a boss. Part 2 is your first responders. These are the spells you use when your party is taking damage and you need to begin healing them. I place Rejuvenation and Wild Growth in this category. Rejuve for when one or two allies need healing, and Wild Growth for when three or more need healing. When there's very high amounts of burst damage incoming, I sometimes choose to use both. In these situations, I prefer to use Rejuve first and then Wild Growth after, because the duration of Rejuve is longer, and also Wild Growth does most of its healing right away. The third and final part is the Cleanup Crew. These are the spells you use when your party's taking heavy damage and you need direct healing for them to live. Regrowth and Swift Mend are in this category. Regrowth not only is quite mana inefficient, but also has a cast time, so you want to avoid having to spam it unless necessary. Swift Mend's a really good spell, however, it's on a 25-second cooldown, so you don't want to waste it if you don't have to. The biggest mistakes often come from the spells in this category. Healers I see use Regrowth or Swift Mend on targets before using the Rejuve, and even sometimes healing targets that aren't even in danger. If your ally isn't going to be taking any more damage, you can simply leave the first responder HOTS up and they'll get healed back to full without the need to cast a single regrowth. If you're having trouble with this ordering of skills, you can use what I like to call the cultivation method. It's very simple. It's just that you should only be using regrowth or Swift Mend on an ally if they have cultivation on them. This means that not only do you have to use a Rejuve on your target first before you do any direct healing, but the target must also drop below 40% health in order to proc cultivation. Since it's very unlikely that a target needs more than Rejuve and Efflow while they're above 60% health, the cultivation method is a great way to ensure you aren't wasting mana and time on people who don't actually need help. If you're having trouble finding time to use damage or utility spells in a dungeon, the cultivation method will immediately free up a large portion of the unnecessary healing that you're doing. Before we move past healing, I want to talk about Tranquility. I like to think of Trank as being able to cast Regrowth on your entire party at the same time. It's great for high group damage, but it's ultimately not game changing. To get full value from your Trank, you should use Efflow and Wild Growth first, just like you would do if you're pressing Regrowth. Trank also leaves an 8-second hot on everyone, which will benefit your mastery. You can cancel your Trank at any time, and the hot still persists for 8 seconds. In tight situations, you can use Trank and then immediately cancel it to apply the hot to everyone. Just keep in mind that although the description mentions the hot is stacking, it doesn't actually give you multiple mastery stacks, just one. Next, I want to talk about defensive options. I believe the most important thing you should be doing as a healer is staying alive. I know this might seem obvious, but you should never lose sight of this as you're tunneling trying to kill a boss or save a teammate. If your team dies, you can battle res them, but if you die, that might mean the immediate end of your run. I believe as a healer, the thing you're judged on the most is how often you die. The healers who are most consistent and stay alive the most often are considered the best healers, regardless of the healing or damage they do. Barkskin is a 12-second duration, 60-second cooldown defensive. Because of its short cooldown, you can be pressing it very often, whenever you're worried about incoming damage. If you have the Azurite trait, Ursoc's Endurance, it also adds a decent absorb, making it an even more powerful defensive option. Be sure to be pressing this, especially during boss encounters with high group damage to conserve mana. Bear form gives you a large health and armor buff and is especially useful for large amounts of physical damage. Because it has no cooldown or mana cost, you can use it to mitigate damage whenever you want. Just keep in mind that you can't be casting healing spells in bear form, so generally you want to be placing heals right before the incoming damage, then bear form just before the damage hits. Remember, you can wild charge in bear form to get away from danger while still being resilient to damage. I often use this technique if I grab threat from healing, and I want to rush quickly to the tank so that he can grab threat back, but also might end up taking a few attacks in the meantime. Wild Charge is a defensive, utility, and movement ability all wrapped into one. It allows you to move instantly to an ally while you're in human form, forwards in travel form, and towards an enemy in cat or bear form. Wild Charge should be used constantly throughout a dungeon to slightly adjust positioning without having to move. The situations to use Wild Charge are near endless, and I encourage you to experiment for yourself with learning it to use it effectively. You should have a mouse over macro for Wild Charge so that you can quickly dash to an ally without having to worry about clicking on them. The best advice I can give for Wild Charge is try and plan ahead what you're going to do in order to minimize reaction time. For example, you might say, if I'm about to get harpooned into this pack, I'm going to Wild Charge to this mage. That way, when it happens, you can immediately react and get to safety before anything bad happens. Next, I want to talk about utility. Next to surviving, quick and precise use of your utility spells will be noticed by your teammates more than anything else that you do. Mythic Plus is a team game, and as a healer, before you think about how to improve your own damage, you should be thinking about how to improve your team's damage. I'd like to talk more about this in depth in a future video, but I believe good use of utility spells is the biggest separation between druids stuck pugging 15 to 19s and druids who eventually find a home in a regular group and advance on to higher keys. Druid has the biggest utility kit of any healer, and using it effectively will absolutely determine whether or not you time keys. Typhoon is a crucial part of the Druid toolkit, and with a 30-second cooldown, it can see a lot of different uses in a dungeon. It can be used to interrupt some mob casts, and as a healer, this may be your only option. You can use it to push mobs, which can be used to get them out of Sanguine, or to bring a stubborn, ranged, or caster mob into a group for better cleave, which is especially important during bolstering weeks. You can combine Wild Charge and Typhoon to jump to your tank, and then Typhoon the mobs away if they're in danger. It's important that you're patient and precise with your use of Typhoon. Remember, it's pushing everything away, so if you're using it to interrupt a cast, you want to try and either hit one or all of the mobs so that you don't push the pack all over the place. Also be careful not to push mobs behind your tank, putting them in danger of getting hit in the back. When I'm going to use a Typhoon on a group of mobs, I try and warn my team as early as I can so they can prepare for it and don't get caught off guard. Our tank might say, I don't have a stop for the next slam, and I'll say, okay, I'm going to Typhoon the next one. Ursul's Vortex is a 10-second area of effect slow that pulls mobs back into it if they try to escape. It's an extremely powerful tool for keeping mobs grouped and also can be used to help your tank kite. Be warned though, once it's placed, it cannot be undone. So if your tank is trying to move mobs, he's not going to be able to. And if you vortex some mobs in a Sanguine pool, you better believe they're going to get healed to full. Another great use for Ursul's is stopping enemies who leap away onto players. This will help your DPS even cleave all of the mobs, and in some situations, it even fully negates their dangerous leap attacks. Ursals and Typhoon work hand in hand with each other. You can Typhoon before you Ursals to make sure the mobs are grouped up even tighter. Likewise, you can Ursals right before you Typhoon if you need to interrupt a cast but also don't want the mobs to be displaced, as the Ursals will grab them all back together. If you place the sloppy Ursals, you can also try to position yourself nearby in case you need to Typhoon them out if the mobs get pulled back into a bad area. Entangling Roots is a 0 cooldown immobilize effect that breaks on damage. It can be used to stop dangerous patrols that are on a collision course with your group, or simply just to stop a patrol in the right place if your group isn't quite ready for it. To stop a full patrolling group, you must root the leader of the group, which is different depending on each pack, so it does take a bit of testing. Root can also be used to stop fleeing mobs, and also doesn't put you in combat if you use it on mobs, so you can use it when mobs need to be CC'd if your team isn't quite ready yet. Soothe removes enrage effects, and it is invaluable against certain mobs, especially during raging weeks. I recommend setting up a focus target soothe macro and putting important mobs that need to be soothed on focus before going into a pack. That way, you can quickly soothe a dangerous enemy without having to click through a sea of enemies in the midst of a tough pull. Growl is a taunt that must be used in bear form and can be used as a way to further control mobs. You almost never want to be in range of mobs once you taunt them. However, with Ursals, Wild Charge, Typhoon, and Root, it should be pretty safe to do on any non-boss enemies. You can taunt mobs away from your tank if they're in danger, or simply if you just want to move them to a different place. The most important thing with taunt is that you have to have a good level of communication with your tank. A tank's goal is to keep threat on everything, and when they see mobs randomly dropping threat, they may get worried or simply just taunt it right back away from you. Use taunt sparingly, and always try and let your tank know ahead of time so that they know what's coming. In an emergency, however, you can taunt mobs off your tank if they're getting feared or disoriented, especially by a boss effect if you're worried about them or someone else getting killed. Hibernate is a crowd control effect that only works on beasts and dragonkin. It has a few niche uses, like on Bloodswarmers and Underrot, and breaking the snake roots in the Temple of Sethrula's second boss. It also can be used in emergency CC if you accidentally pull a group of enemies that has a beast in it. Lastly, let's go over the damage rotation. The majority of your damage as a druid comes from damage over time effects, both in human and cat form. Instead of going over the specific math in order to min-max damage, I instead want to just talk about proper use of all the abilities in the rotation. Referring back to the 3-part healing rotation, should generally be pressing your first defense healing spells first, and then continuing on to the damage rotation if no further healing is necessary. Sunfire is the most important damage spell you have, and it should be pressed on every trash pull, even the more difficult ones. Just one spell can be doing 10 or 15k DPS on a pack, and it is always worth it to press, even if you might be a bit worried about upcoming damage. Moonfire can be used on priority targets, or simply all targets if you can't enter cat form safely. Solar Wrath is pretty low damage and should only be used if both Sunfire and Moonfire are applied and you cannot enter melee. To further increase your damage, once your dots are applied, you can enter cat form. Cat form allows you 2 more dots to apply for a total of 4, as well as a builder spender combo and a spell to press an AoE, which is swipe. The most important thing to consider when entering cat form is, how many spells am I likely able to press before I have to switch back to heal? If you only have time for a rake and a swipe before having to switch back to heal, it's probably better that you just stick in human form and apply a few Moonfires, or maybe reapply your Sunfire instead. This is because you have to cast cat form, which does nothing. You only want to press it if you know you're going to get benefit from it for a while. My general rule is that I usually don't go into cat form unless I think I'll be able to spend at least 5 seconds before having to heal again. This definitely comes with experience, so you may not find as much use right away in cat form. However, as you understand more about each dungeon, you'll find more and more opportunities for it. If possible, you can start the fight in stealth and then wild charge Rake to get the double damage bonus from Rake. It stuns the mob, which isn't always a good thing if your tank is trying to move the pack to a specific location or if someone needs to use stuns to keep a mob from casting spells. I generally try and rake unimportant melee trash mobs to slightly prevent damage while also not disrupting too much my team is trying to do. Remember that you can pre-pot in stealth without breaking your stealth, and using pre-pots in a dungeon alongside scrolls and flask will be a noticeable damage buff. As most of your damage is coming from dots, it's important not to waste time reapplying dots when the mob is just about to die soon. I like to use the 2.5 million health rule, although you can be changing the number slightly depending on your group's composition. If a mob has 2.5 million or more health, it's always worth refreshing your dots. And if it has less, you should generally just swipe, shred, or solar wrath. With Sunfire, this applies to the whole pack. If the combined health of all the mobs is 2.5 million or more, then it is probably worth reapplying Sunfire. This should help efficiency until you get a good idea on exactly when to refresh or not refresh. So this just about covers all the basics. You should now have a good idea of fundamentally strong rotation and what sorts of utility is expected of you. I stressed this in the first video as well, but it's so important that I want to mention it again. Experience is everything. It takes many depletes and mistakes in order to gain the knowledge to know what to look for to get full value out of your toolkit. So don't be too hard on yourself for not utilizing everything that is available to you, because as a druid, there's a hell of a lot. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you clicked the like and subscribe buttons for me, as well as leave any questions you have or ideas for future videos in the comments. You can watch me push keys live on twitch.tv/yummytv. Happy keying!